The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar presented by HSG, After the Surge, Employed Network Leadership Considerations for the second half of 2020. My name is Travis Ansel. With me is Dr. Terry McWilliams. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. You can submit questions via the questions tab on your control panel within the GoToMeeting framework. We will try to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. If you do submit a question, you will not be identified, nor will your organization, so feel free to ask specific questions and we'll make sure we get you specific answers. Today's event will be available for on-demand viewing at www.hsgadvisors.com by this time tomorrow. Everyone who attends will also get a link to both the on-demand recording as well as a full slide deck within the next day or two. So jumping into today's presentation, as I mentioned, my name is Travis Ansel, Managing Partner of HSG. With me, Dr. Terry McWilliams, Director and Chief Clinical Consultant. Today we're talking about leadership considerations for the second half of 2020 for leaders of employed networks. Very relevant topic, given we are slowly or quickly, depending on your perspective, moving into the second half of 2020. Some of our surge activities around COVID are hopefully dying down, at least for a few months, and we're seeing a lot of organizations start to think about what do we do now that we've kind of been disrupted. How do we get back to where we want to be? How do we get on the right path? And so that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. As a reminder, HSG, our focus is working with health systems around the country, largely on employed network considerations. Trying to help organizations create efficient and optimal networks that, by our language, move towards high performance. And so we've been doing that for over 20 years. One of the things you may be familiar with is our book, Employed Physician Networks, which we published in partnership with ACHE. Our Physician Network Growth Phases framework is very relevant to today's discussion because one of the things we're concerned about, looking at the disruption that's occurred over the last, let's say, 10 to 12 weeks, as COVID has kind of turned everybody's world upside down, is the fact that there's a lot of opportunity for physician networks to move backwards in their progression across what we see as a normal evolution for an employed network. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. Today's webinar is part of a series that we've been doing throughout the summer, just trying to get as much information out there as possible to organizations who may be looking for it, given everything that's going on in the world. Next week, we'll be talking about virtual health and how to make that more of a long-term strategy. And then on June 11th, we're getting a ton of questions about advanced practitioner utilization. I think a lot of organizations reevaluating their care models, reevaluating how do we use APPs at top of license and what are the frameworks that get them there. So we'll be talking about that on June 11th. Feel free to sign up at any of these at the link at the top of this slide. So in terms of today's discussion, we basically will be talking about three things. One, Terry and I have put together some thoughts about the impact of COVID-19 on physician networks and what's fundamentally changed from a leadership perspective, with a real emphasis on the administrative physician relationship and the role of physician leadership within employed networks. So we're going to start by talking about that. Two, we're going to talk about our view on leadership priorities for employed physician networks. And this is really, the title is for the second half of 2020 and probably invariably drifting into the start of 2021. But what do we think leaders of employed physician networks should be focused on right now? And then three, just a couple summary thoughts on putting priorities into context with your provider. So obviously we can sit around and talk about everything leadership teams should be doing, but how do we put that in the context of our entire employed group and kind of bring people along? And then we'll be happy to take questions at the end of the presentation. So starting with what's fundamentally changed. So from an overview perspective, and we're going to drill into each of these, as Terry and I thought about it, there were five things that we have concerns about. One, COVID really tested a lot of organizations, tested their willingness to involve physicians and physician leadership structures in decision making about employed networks. And we saw that being highly variable to what extent, say, a physician advisory council or physician leadership council played in the role of helping the organization manage through COVID. So we're going to talk about that. Two, clearly telehealth, virtual health has been a major disruptor, a positive disruptor in a lot of ways, but a disruptor to operations and to our access strategy. So we want to talk about how that impacts the organization. Three, we're, as with any big change, and this is of course one of the biggest changes, concerned about the cadence that most organizations have developed around operations and financial management. So our data communication, our meeting structures, everything we've put into place from an employee network perspective that gets information to the right people, gets the providers brought along, gives management the right information. All of that, I think in most networks, I think everybody would agree, has been pretty severely disrupted. And there's a lot of opportunity for that not to get back to normal. Not that we're going to get back to normal anytime soon, but getting back into a flow of communicating the right information and being able to make management decisions off of information and have everyone understand those decisions. That we believe that's disrupted, so we'll talk about that. Four, a lot of opportunity for disruptions in culture. If you're familiar with our philosophy around employee networks, culture drives everything. There's a lot of things that were negative for culture in the last 8 to 10, 12 weeks. So we'll talk about some of those. And then five, our view is that there's a lot of opportunity for provider compensation, the way that providers feel about compensation to change, given everything that's going on. And so we'll talk about that as well. So starting off with physician leadership decision making, Terry, you want to kind of walk us through this part?
Sure thing. Thanks, Travis. So, a lot of us have wondered about the role that physician leadership councils have played in the decisions related to the changes in business operations and clinical operations during the major part of the COVID-19 public health emergency. And, there are some organizations we found that the leadership council is so ingrained in the problem solving and decision making process that they played a central role in how things happened. And we found that others used the councils rather variably, to be kind, including some that didn't utilize them at all and reverted to the tried and true method of administration making decisions and passing the information down. So it calls into question the role of the Leadership Council in making operational decisions, clinical business operations decisions, clinical operations decisions, staffing, who was considered essential in the practices versus who might be able to be, I almost used some terms that would not have been great, but those who are less essential and could be spared from the office environment. The whole concept of compensation and how we would keep providers whole, or would we keep providers whole through this process, and then the whole spectrum of furloughing or repurposing our provider staff as well as our support staff. So it seemed to come down to there were those that definitely involved the Leadership Council in the decision-making process, and for those, we kind of wonder, do these lessons learned become a launching point for the next phase of physician leadership in the network? I mean, did we, in utilizing the structure to achieve our outcomes, what can we learn from that? And how might that inform the maturation of that structure and the interplay with administration in future activities? For those that we found did not utilize the physician leadership, we kind of wonder what needs to change culturally to cultivate greater involvement as just a matter of fact. This is the way we do business. This is the way we problem solve. This is the way we make decisions. And that leads to certain introspective questions, right? So, does the health system or network administration view the physician leadership structure as a crucial partner in that problem solving and decision making process, or just a pain in the tush, or just somebody we want to bounce things off of on a periodic basis? Does the charter support involvement of physician leadership, and to what degree? Over the past couple of years, we found that some leadership council charters were more established more of a communications vehicle as opposed to a true problem-solving decision-making group. So if we weren't using the council in that process, is it because of the way they're designed and what they were charged with in their functionalities? Was it a matter of a meeting structure? So for instance, some organizations said, well, the council meets once a month. We needed to make real-time decisions by the minute, by the hour, and 90% of our time was dedicated to this. And, it just didn't really prove to be conducive to getting things done. And then finally, we have subcommittees that can work on multiple things, including operations and IT and other aspects. Do we have a structure in place that could be utilized to its fullest advantage? And again, our experience has been, we've talked to groups that have been all across that spectrum of activity. But for each of these, the response to the COVID-19 crisis really permits a time of introspection and internal review to look at the role of physician leadership in the everyday problem solving and decision making processes, and how we might want to cultivate differences over time. Another major disruptor from the COVID-19 process was the impact it had on the development and implementation of telehealth or virtual health activities. Many organizations said that we definitely need to do something about telehealth in the next decade. It's an evolving situation. We need to look at it, but just hadn't gotten there, or they had plans on the books but just hadn't acted on them. And suddenly we were finding that the groups had to implement and execute that strategy in 8 weeks or 2 weeks, or for some, just a couple of days. But the impact of that implementation and deployment affects multiple facets of the network, especially going forward. Sustainability has two facets that we found. The first was initial revenue maintenance and trying to maximize revenue from patient care that was not able to be provided in a traditional face-to-face manner or in a much reduced capacity for that. But going forward, there's a lot of concern that patients have been always concerned about catching something in either a hospital-based interaction or a medical office-based interaction. And there's a lot of concern out there that we've heard and that's been written about patients being reluctant to go back into that environment because of what they might catch, in spite of all the extra effort being made. So sustainability of revenue, during the height of the crisis, we think will continue for a period of time until things get closer to the prior normal. But the other sustainability factor is the virtual care delivery itself. During the public health emergency, as we're all aware, multiple regulatory restrictions were waived, multiple reimbursement impediments were addressed, and we suddenly became reimbursed the same as for a tele or virtual care visit as we would for an in-person face-to-face visit. We anticipate that as the public health emergency is lifted, that there will be a return to greater restrictions. Now, the original restrictions on virtual care were rather extensive on behalf of CMS and the commercial payers. We think that will change, but nobody really knows for sure exactly how that will change. So but most of us feel that virtual care is here to stay. So no matter how much we return to business as usual in a face-to-face office-based encounter, patients have become progressively accustomed to the greater convenience of virtual care when it makes sense and is a safe delivery model for their situation. So the demand will be there on the patient side. It's up to us to figure out how we incorporate that into our daily care delivery model and how it can be sustained in the post-COVID environment. And so as the graphic shows over on the right, the in our survey that we did with 50 key executives across the country, 94% of the respondents agreed that virtual visits will be part of their strategy after COVID-19, and everything in the literature would support that. The question becomes, how do we do that? You know, what mechanisms do we do? How do we incorporate that in our care delivery model? And in getting through this transition, what will our ultimate virtual care strategy evolve into, and how will we incorporate that? What impact will that model have on staffing, scheduling, compensation? You know, the RVU credit, if we're working on a straight RVU model or a base plus individual productivity model, right now with the long-term CMS virtual visits and e-health type of interactions, the RVU credit is less than a face-to-face encounter. And so we've heard providers say that before COVID-19, why should we adopt something and spend about the same amount of time but get half the credit for it? That means that I'll need to work twice as much, twice as hard for virtual encounters to get the same amount of income. And so, you know, if we're really going to promote virtual care as a linchpin of our care delivery model, then we have to look at the impact on provider compensation. Revenue cycle will be impacted because of the very specific documentation and coding requirements, and making sure that we capture all that correctly so we can have clean claim submissions and minimal denials. The management infrastructure that's required to support this also can be significant. Our IT capabilities and telecommunications capabilities, especially in our remote practices, may require some extra attention to be able to fulfill expectations of this type of care delivery. And finally, you know, we developed our telehealth strategy in a pre-COVID mindset. A lot of the keeping up with daily business and putting out fires probably did not allow a great opportunity to step back and look at how this affected future strategy, not only in telehealth per se, but across the organization. So, you know, as we're starting to emerge from the at least the greatest impact of the early disruption caused by COVID-19, there's an opportunity to take a step back, figure out where everything fits in our long-term strategy and what needs to be adjusted so that we can develop specific action plans to move forward and take full advantage of the unexpected opportunities that arose with the telemedicine environment.
So moving to our third priority, which is again addressing the disruption to the cadence of operational and financial management of the network. You know, none of the groups we've talked to in the past few months have felt like COVID has been a positive impact on financials of both the health system and the employed physician network. You know, our view, the potential long-term disruption here is, over the past, Terry, I would say 3 to 5 years, we've seen fewer and fewer networks that are probably feeling like that managing the finances of their employed network is priority number one. I think that's been a mixture of organizations have increasingly gotten better and better controls around the subsidy generated by their network, along with maybe organizational tolerance for employed group subsidy or employed group investment. That tolerance may be increasing at the executive or board level as we've been able to increase the level of education and understand why employed networks don't run at break even and don't run like private practices. The threat here, though, is that we've basically had 2 or 3 months where our data hasn't been as good, hasn't been shared as well. our normal meetings that provided some level of operational and financial control of large employed networks, have likely gone by the wayside or been disrupted. And that in itself is a challenge, but what we expect to happen is as health systems, really sort through the financial impact of what has happened over the last 3 months, and we see, margins that are off by the few financial statements I've seen, 20+% across the board. Those employed physician network subsidies are going to start becoming a target again from our perspective. I think we're going to see a lot more board and executive level interest in reducing subsidies, and that'll be outside of just the deficits in productivity. That'll be starting to manage the bottom half of the P&L as well. So the questions that we think are important for employed physician network leaders to answer right now is what's our plan? What's our plan for one? Let's understand where we were before COVID hit. Let's understand where we are now that COVID's hit. Where do we expect to get back to? And what's our long-term plan for developing a sustainable subsidy? Which in a lot of organizations, we just have a plan for here's how much we're going to have. Here's what our subsidy is going to be. But what's our plan for if we need to proactively manage and mitigate subsidy? From an employed network leadership perspective, that's something we want to have a plan for. That's where we want to know where our flexibility is. And if our leadership team says, our margins off, our budget's off 10, 20% come Q3, we need to start aggressively managing finances. We want to have as proactive as a plan as possible in order to ensure that we're going to be able to maintain operations in a way that provides the most financial sustainability for the organization. Another thing worth throwing onto the pile there as we're thinking about the financial investment in the organization. Despite health system finances really taking a hit over the past few months, we do expect a lot of consolidation of the remaining independent practices in a lot of markets, realizing that as bad as things have been for health systems, smaller independent practices are getting it even worse, but without any of the financial liquidity that maybe some health systems have. And so that relates to our bottom bullet on slide 12 here, which is how does unplanned growth impact the network? And so while as we talked to a lot of health systems around the country, the idea of adding providers right now, the idea of acquiring and employing additional providers right now seems like something we neither have the financial or operational bandwidth to deal with. Those opportunities are going to become available, we believe. Those opportunities to bring independent physicians into the employed network infrastructure and demand from independent physicians to do that is going to be something that organizations will have to deal with. And it'll be looked at as a short-term additional financial disruptor, but something that long-term is maybe a valuably strategically. So we have not only the how do we deal with our current financial and operational performance and how do we get that back on track, but the specter of maybe we're also going to be adding FTEs over the next 6 to 12 months. And so we need to have a proactive plan for what that looks like as well. Well, thinking about all of those financial and operational disruptions, along with Terry's comments around disruptions to physician leadership and how well did we really utilize physician leadership, that takes us into thinking about disruptions to culture. And as we noted earlier, the COVID-19 environment, the rapid need for decision making, and then the financial and operational stressors placed on the network, all of those things, perfect storm of a great way to disrupt a culture that your organization has probably been working hard to build over the last decade. Not a lot of organizations feel fantastic about their culture, but viewing it as a work in process to building something that's truly cohesive. This was a great environment to undo a lot of that work. So furloughs of providers and staff, changing around staff, physicians that the majority who are paid on some productivity-based metric, whether that's straight work RVU, base plus incentive, revenue minus expense, having productivity get decimated and having providers bear a lot of that in terms of their reduction on comp, that's always damaging culturally. We heard anecdotally a lot of comments from physicians in the environment that they felt like decision making was really more combative, that it wasn't really in working with administration, which is always something that's great for destroying culture. And overall, I mean, the trust between providers and administration within a health system heard a lot of stories about trust not maybe being where it was in February because of all the things that are on this slide. And again, one of the concerns we have as it comes back to our physician network growth phases is disrupting culture is the best way to move backwards, because when culture is not there and we're not all one team and we're not all working towards one shared vision of where we're heading, and it becomes a little bit more, this is how this is impacting me and not my practice or my network. That's a great way to get back into the operational chaos mindset of we need to be fighting fires, we need to be dealing with providers individually. Our infrastructure is being disrupted because we're dealing with the day-to-day and not really looking at the long term. And culture is really the backbone of all of that. So it's really important that we keep that in mind and proactively try to address that, which we'll talk a little bit about in our next section around building a shared vision. And then the last thing, Terry, was views on provider compensation.
Yeah, and everybody's reported some difficulties with this over time, and we've alluded to the straight productivity models as being the having the greatest risk for disruptive activity during the COVID-19 difficulties. So individual providers who are on a straight RVU compensation model or revenue minus expense, if they weren't generating revenue and they weren't generating RVUs, what would become of their income? And even though most are based on a draw and a reconciliation, questions abounded as how do we reconcile that? Do we try to keep providers whole? Do they bear the same financial brunt that everyone else bears? If they're on a base plus individual RVU productivity model, and these individuals are taking a lesser draw to have a greater bonus based on RVU incentives, and they're not achieving those, what's the impact of that? And how do we reconcile all those elements and trying to keep providers engaged with the organization all at the same time? I mean, that just created a myriad of difficulties for many organizations. And as was noted on our survey, even though slightly over half did not make any temporary or short-term changes in their compensation models, there were significant numbers who indicated they might need to reevaluate or redesign the compensation model based on what was experienced during the COVID-19 crisis. And we sound, I want to avoid the impression that we're saying that the COVID crisis is over. We're not saying that at all. The height of it for most of us, we hope is behind us, at least for the time being. But the transition out of it and emerging from it, creates ongoing issues within networks, compensation being just one of them. So coming out of this, many providers were very looked at productivity-based compensation in a favorable light. It recognized my effort. If I expended more effort, it was recognized, and I could have a direct impact on my income based on the amount of effort that I expended. In a situation in which, regardless of how much I would want to work or how much of a difference I would want to make, if I'm not able to make that difference, why should my compensation be harmed with a situation that I have no control over and was not of my doing. So there's that whole perception of, does it really recognize my level of involvement? Does it really recognize what my intent would be when I'm on a straight productivity model, and there's no productivity to be had? The other aspect is, will health systems tolerate a change in a period where volumes may continue to be disrupted? So, back to, a lot of the straight productivity models were very favorable to the bottom line and the revenue, net revenue kind of operating margin. When that falls away and, providers are looking for, reasonable compensation for being available and continuing services within an organization, especially if they have hospital-based activities, but not being compensated as they're used to, where does that dynamic come from the health system side, and wanting to keep providers engaged, yet have them share in the risk associated with low volume and low revenue times. And finally, there are many, although there are many areas in the country that have a capitated reimbursement environment, most areas of the country do not, and most were still extremely entrenched in the fee-for-service mentality, as well as the fee-for-service reimbursement model. Many of those same organizations felt that any talk of full risk sharing or capitation was so far in the future, they didn't even want to think about it. But during the low volume times, the capitated reimbursement model was starting to get some favored attention. If I'm getting a per member per month reimbursement value to take care of a population, if I do that in the best way possible, that creates a fairly stable revenue generating and compensation based model that might be able to withstand these low volume times better. When we're not, looking at the volume of services that need to be rendered to keep revenue streams and compensation plans rolling, the per member per month steadiness of a capitated environment helps both the system and the providers that are working within the system. And Travis, we've been talking that it's kind of amazing that this talk even evolved, considering everybody was resisting any movement away from fee for service and impairment of revenue generation based on metrics other than straight volume. So we've thought this was a really interesting thing that's raised its head, I think unexpectedly. But what impact will that have on us looking at future compensation models? I think starts to come into play now.
Yeah, Terry, I absolutely agree. I mean, it's obviously, there's probably a lot of people on the webinar saying that, well, that's not going to be our market no matter what. But I think it's definitely going to come a lot quicker and probably to a lot more markets than we may have expected a few months ago. All right, so moving into our leadership priorities for employed physician networks for 2020. We have 6 things we want to talk about. If anybody thinks that this is particularly useful, at the link on the right side of the page, there's a blog post on ACHE that summarizes this content on which this presentation was built on, and obviously we're delving a lot further into these things, but something if you want to circulate it around your organization, easy to get to right there. 6 things we want to talk about. 1, optimizing our network for the major operational changes we talked about in the previous section. 2, access. Always important, was important before. Now we want to re-emphasize that access is really what we need to be talking about as a physician leadership group, as an employed physician network leadership group. 3, talk about preparing for an influx of new providers. So how do we deal with, again, an expected surge in independents seeking employment. 4, reevaluating or developing shared vision Shared vision is, again, one of the most critical things that we think is required to be in place for a network to truly evolve out of kind of the day-to-day mindset and really start developing a cohesive culture, and really working to evolve into a high-performing group. So that is going to be a priority, and we'll talk more about that. 5, evolving management infrastructure and organizational structure, and then 6, circling back around on the dynamics of physician compensation. How do we deal with that, and creating a plan for dealing with that? So those are the 6 things that we're going to talk through. Terry, you want to kind of lead us off by jumping into major operational changes in care delivery?
Yeah, and not surprisingly, there's going to be an emphasis on the virtual care and telehealth world. I know it sounds like maybe we're beating that horse a little bit, but you know, in coming out of the crisis mode of operating, you know, we feel there's a need to identify and address gaps between what was implemented to be operational during the throes of the public health emergency and transitioning to an optimal performance for long-term sustainability. You know, we mentioned already the number of waivers that are in place only during the public health emergency. And as those are lifted, you know, what is going to be the impact of virtual care in our long-term care delivery, but also what impact will that have on our revenue cycle? So we think at this juncture that there are several key areas of focus related to this phenomenon. The first is reviewing operational processes to ensure that the virtual care initiatives put in place during the COVID crisis fit in a post-COVID era. You know, one of the elements that we feel fairly strongly will go away, you know, once the public health emergency is lifted, is the waiver about not having secure telecommunications platforms for the interactions. And this is focused mostly on the video portion of the platform. You know, right now we can still utilize things like Zoom for those interactions, but that's not felt to be, well, it wasn't adequate going into COVID-19, and it's not felt to be able to survive afterwards. So do we need to tap into our EMR-based video capabilities, or do we need to layer a separate system on top of it? And if we do, either of those may have issues with budget support, and for separate systems having a business associate agreement in place to take care of HIPAA-related issues. We mentioned EMR-based because we found that, you know, there are several EMRs that have that capability within modules, but may not have been activated or purchased. So, you know, looking for that capability with some of the greater or more popular EMR platforms, budgeting to be able to implement it with all the other requirements that would go along with that, or just separately layering a system on. Either way, there's some investigation and planning that would need to be done. You know, looking at staffing models, do we need to alter our staffing models, or do we need to make other investments to really make this part and parcel of our daily operations? And this will then come down into redesigning our care delivery methodologies and scheduling, both on the patient side but also on the provider side, to fully augment patient access to our practices and meet patients where they want to be met. There was a lot written before the pandemic about our younger generations preferring virtual care over office visits, but we've heard from all of our patients over the years of the wonderment, do I really need to come into the office to do, you know, pick a topic? And with the COVID-19 changes, we're hearing more and more from patients about, you know, the flexibility and convenience associated with virtual care as opposed to in-office care. this should cause most of us, if we haven't already, to really look at how we utilize our patient portal within the EMR. A number of us artificially minimized how much information or utility was available through the portal, but things like scheduling appointments, secure messaging are elements that many organizations have not pursued, and in part or in large part, perhaps to provide a reluctance. But this is a time where we need to look at how we can utilize what's at our the tools at our disposal to try to help and augment our interactions with patients. As we do these things, we need to actively market these services to patients so they know that they're available, and they know that they can distinguish us within the marketplace because we're focused on their convenience and providing safe, effective care at all times. And then finally, looking at options for ongoing reimbursement, especially with commercial payers. CMS has been very upfront with what they'll pay for. We're wondering how they're going to come out of the public health emergency and what regulatory changes, what reimbursement changes will accompany some regulatory changes. But CMS has been more proactive in this area than many of the commercial insurers. So exploring options for ongoing reimbursement for virtual care with commercial insurers is really, I think, a fairly big ticket item because one of the major barriers for virtual care and telehealth was the lack of reimbursement for those activities. So all these things we think can help optimize the incorporation of virtual care within our care delivery model, and look at the operational changes in our daily processes and procedures to accommodate that.
Thanks, Terry. So the second priority we want to talk about was emphasizing access, and of course, access has been a challenge and been a priority for every physician network around the country. Right now, I think various markets are dealing with relative experiences in terms of the pent up routine and elective care that's expected to return. Some markets finding that's been very slow. Some markets finding it's bounced back very well. But our view is, for the most part, demand for care is going to return to every market over time. And how variable that is, but market to market is probably not a reason to ignore access as a strategy. Virtual health, telehealth adoption in a number of our webinars this summer, we've been, or I guess spring, we've been talking about how virtual health and telehealth's created a new dynamic around access. Really expect it to continue to push consumers' expectations on what timely access means, as well as creating additional competitive dynamics around providing timely access. So, especially in competitive markets, time for new patient appointments, probably going to get consumers probably going to be a little less tolerant. Times for acute appointments, probably going to be a little less tolerant. It's going to become another dynamic on which we compete as a health system to acquire and keep patients. So in terms of addressing this, so five things we want to talk about. One, at the physician leadership level, one of the things we see networks really struggle with is creating a common definition of access. So access, we all want it, we all need it, we all agree it's a priority, but what does it actually mean? What does it mean in terms of, yeah, you need to maximize your schedule and make sure all the slots are filled, but we also need to be able to integrate 3 to 5, acute appointments a day, or we need to be able to integrate whereas your schedule may have contained 30 slots for new and existing patient appointments that were in office. Now, Dr. X, 2/3 of your schedule might be in office, 1/3 of it might be telehealth. And that's just on the patient side of access. That's not even talking about the referral side of access. What are our expectations of providers in the network of being able to get patients in when we have an endocrine referral, when we have a cardiology referral, providers who who wear their 2-month wait times or 6-month wait times as badges of honors. That's not really within our definition of access, with anyone's definition of access. But creating those standards and building those into your vision and your culture, and then having them integrate into your operation so that we change things like schedule, like care model, like how we use our advanced practitioners and clinical staff in the practices in order to achieve those access goals. Defining those standards is the first thing we need to do. Second part, we're seeing, as we mentioned earlier, talking about our future webinars, seeing a lot of interest about advanced practitioner utilization and what the right mix is, especially if we're preparing for a surge in kind of elective and routine stuff. How do we best utilize advanced practice providers within a practice, and how does the dynamic change in terms of what patients does an APP see versus what patients does a physician see, and really putting some standards around that so that we don't have physicians seeing patients that are routine and standard follow-up care with only one condition, and really emphasizing their role in either taking on new patient appointments or seeing those really multi-chronic patients. So doing that is certainly a priority from an access perspective. Scheduling, we're seeing a lot of counseling a lot of organizations on how do we blend together a schedule? What's the optimal way to blend together a schedule to maximize in-office and virtual appointments? We're thinking a lot of providers, whereas virtual health for a lot of organizations might have meant dedicated virtual health providers, in a lot of cases advanced practitioners, and dedicated in-office providers, with that being the vast majority. We're with consumer expectations around virtual health and telehealth. Our view is providers are going to have to reasonably be able to do both. And then the second part of scheduling is how do we create priority access for new patients? Again, if access is one of those things we're going to be competing on even more in kind of this new world post-surge. How do we create priority access for new patients and get them into the network? And from our view, having organizational control of the schedule and having that live within the context of our vision and our culture that we're going to create access is a key there. We're also seeing a lot of interest in kind of care model. How do we evolve our care model away from the one physician, one MA model, and how do we really utilize not only our advanced practice providers, but also the rest of our clinical staff at top of license so that we can truly maximize the productivity of our staff, whether that be in an in-office or virtual setting. And then 5, the one thing that is really about maximizing our in-office efficiency is increased use of patient portals so that we can limit that kind of pre-visit activity and really maximize capacity and really get the pre-work done so that our office can efficiently get patients through the door. Again, all with the goal of creating access. We also want to talk about as a priority, preparing for an influx of new providers. Again, as we emphasized in the last section, we expect, it's not going to be to the level of, say, a 2008 through a 2012, where a lot of the independent practices in this country joined employed physician networks, but certainly of the remaining percentages of independent physicians in the market, we expect a lot of them. We know a lot of them are being hit hard. We expect a lot of them to not come through 2020 with a financial situation that makes sustainable independent practice possible. We see there's a couple avenues for those physicians to take. The one that we expect to be most prevalent is to pursue health system employment. We also could see some PE involvement. We're seeing private equity has a different role in each market. In some markets it's very prevalent, in some markets it's non-existent. But we could see additional PE activity because PE still does have cash to spend. We can also see other kind of upmarket players that have hinted in getting more broadly into physician networks, Amazons, Googles, Walmarts, also getting more aggressive, being cash rich, and seeing assets that may be able to be acquired for relatively cheap. So there's going to be additional independent providers seeking employment. We're encouraging health systems to be proactive and not let their service lines get disrupted by having providers, change their patterns, as well as looking at independent provider acquisition and alignment as maybe a strategic priority and an opportunity to shift patient volume. So what we're advising organizations to do right now, one, in general, don't wait for providers to come to you before you start defining whether or not they're relevant to you. The independent physician component in most markets is not so huge that you're unable to get your arms around it. In general, we recommend creating an inventory for all of your relevant service lines of providers who are not employed or otherwise affiliated with a health system. Prioritize those based upon what our medical staff development plan says, what our service line strategy says. Give them a relative prioritization and start building executive team and board expectations that these are the providers that are relevant in our market and we need to keep. And so when that opportunity does present itself, whether it's us proactively asking them, hey, how are you doing? And wouldn't it be better to maybe come into employed practice? Or when they approach us saying we're exploring our options, we've already kind of made the decision on whether that's a provider we want to move forward with. Two, given it's been a while since a lot of health systems really had to have competencies in quickly acquiring and onboarding providers, it would be a good idea to spend this time developing a consistent, compliant approach to acquisition so that as opportunities present themselves, we're able to act quickly upon them and we're able to get providers onboarded quickly. So that includes things like doing due diligence and acquisition to make sure we understand what we're buying, having a compensation onboarding process to where we're getting providers onto our compensation model in a way that is mutually agreeable to both parties, as well as we're getting them both administratively, on board, as well as with the payers, in order to make sure that we're able to start maximizing their revenue as quickly as possible. And then third, kind of based upon on what we've prioritized, number one, it's a good time to start thinking proactively about if our network does grow as we might expect it to, how do we proactively plan for the management infrastructure needed to bring those providers on and effectively manage their practices? Because again, if you've heard us talk about the one sin that most employed physician networks have incurred over the last 10 to 15 years, it's every one of them grew faster than we built the infrastructure. And that's what really kind of generated that period of operational chaos where we did nothing but fight fires on a day-to-day basis and did nothing but talk about finances. So being proactive as we think about what do we need in terms of bodies, in terms of capabilities, in terms of organizational structure, in terms of governance structure, how does our organization evolve as we bring in new providers? If our network grows by say 10 to 15%, what do we have to do? What else do we need? And is it a small change? Is it just adding directors and practice managers and practice supervisors? Or does a growth of that size really require us to rethink the structure of the network? Terry, you want to talk about shared vision?
Sure thing, thanks. So, there are two camps, right? There's a camp that has shared vision in place, and then there's the group of us that have no idea what we're talking about with a shared vision. So I think for our purposes, the quicker is for those that have a shared vision, what we've just experienced merits reviewing the network's shared vision and its associated strategies and tactics to make sure they're still pertinent. With what we've gone through and where we perceive that we'll be going through in the next several months and year, is what we thought before COVID-19 still applicable in the post-COVID-19 period and the transition there too? Or do the lessons learned and the circumstances that we experience change various elements of our shared vision or the strategies and tactics by which to achieve those that ideal future state? For those that don't have a shared vision, this might be the best opportunity to think about pursuing that option. With COVID-19, we had a common external enemy, and there was a global focus for the network and the entire health system about how we were going to come together and deal with the hand that we were dealt. This could be a defining opportunity to build on those common experiences, develop a formal shared vision for the network's ideal future state, and figure out how we might get there now that we've experienced this and this degree of hopeful cohesiveness to defeat a common enemy. Perhaps we can utilize that momentum to look to the future and develop a formal thought process of where we want to go and how we might get there. We do have, for those who aren't sure what we're talking about with a shared vision, just 2-second actually we don't have time to digress that far. So we'll just say that this is a detailed narrative, several pages long, that define in detail where you'd like to be in the next 5 or 10 years. This is different than the 1 or 2 sentence pithy elevator speech of the vision of we want to be the best ever, but really lays out a roadmap of where we want to go and how to get there. So that defines mutual expectations of providers and administration. It puts the whole context of where we're going in a post-COVID environment into that shared vision framework to allow us to build consensus and know where we're going and how we want to proceed in coming out the other end. And then that can be leveraged in our daily operations, so it's deployed and monitored and drives our decision-making going forward. Travis, anything you would add to that description?
No, I think that's pretty accurate, Terry. I mean, again, this is, from our perspective, this is the basis for everything our management team and position leadership group works together. It becomes the basis for everything that we do. So if we don't have it in place, we need to get it in place. If we do have it in place, it's a great time to reevaluate it and think about what the future of the network looks like, especially in the face of the cultural disruptions we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and those cultural disruptions, I mean, culture is the most difficult thing to evolve, develop, and move. And unfortunately, it's also the easiest to disrupt, as we mentioned earlier. So if there was disruption of culture over time or it failed to evolve well, this is a good mechanism to try to keep it moving forward and get to a point that you'd like it to be. The evolving management infrastructure and organizational structure aspect actually follows along from the shared vision. As you determine what it is you'd like to be, you look at things that are necessary to support that future state and maximize the function of the group. This is a unique opportunity. Again, we keep talking about that, and people are looking for silver linings, but this is a unique opportunity to take a step back and say, how did our structure serve us? Did it do what we needed to do when the chips are down? Did the managed infrastructure perform well? Did we have the right seats on the bus and the right people in the seats so that we can function well? Was our span of control too broad? Did we expect too much of individuals in either breadth or depth of responsibilities that wouldn't be reasonable to expect good performance, in that situation? As a frame of reference, we are strong proponents of thinking that 5 to 7 direct reports, depending on complexity, geographic distribution, and other elements, is about all that can be effectively managed and supervised on a expeditious basis. So if we have a span of control in our networks that extend to 13 to 15 areas of responsibility, and we were wondering why it didn't work very well. This is a great root cause of that level of dysfunction. We talked before about the physician leadership role in this whole process, and so we won't rehash that. But all those questions we asked in those earlier slides come to the fore now as we look at our physician leadership structure in the context of the management infrastructure and the organizational structure of the network at large. And then crisis also tends to point out how well we're supported, or at least feel that we're supported. And in looking at the dedicated resources for the network, if these were shared resources with the hospital or health system, were we well supported in that? Are there lessons learned about the structure of those supporting relationships, or how those relationships functioned, that can help us as we move toward the future? And then the next area that we also have talked about was the whole realm of compensation and aligned compensation with organizational objectives. Again, not to belabor this point, this whole process allows us to take another look at our compensation philosophy. What is our model? If we're in a productivity heavy model, is there an opportunity to balance that a little bit? If we don't have a standing compensation committee, should this be a standing committee within our Physician Leadership Council structure, or perhaps an opportunity to set up an ad hoc committee just to look at where we are today? And Travis, I'll send it back to you for the wrap up here.
Perfect. We appreciate everybody staying the time with us today. We apologize for running a minute over. So a couple of thoughts on putting all these priorities we've talked about today into context. This is a lot to throw at a management team, let alone kind of bringing it back to your provider group at large and saying these are the things we need to do, especially in an environment like this. So putting it in context, I mean, the first step from a leadership perspective is engaging your physician leaders, and we use the term physician or provider leadership council, physician advisory council, physician governance council, whatever you call it. But we've got there's definitely a mixture of we need to get back to normal versus things aren't going back to normal. But we need to build the message that things aren't, we can't operate tomorrow the same way we operated in February, and we're not going to change that by tomorrow. I think a lot of the things we've talked about today, Terry, are things that take months, if not quarters, to implement. But building the expectation that we really need to build on the change that's already occurred, and integrate that into our kind of strategic direction over the next 10 years, integrate it into our vision. And so, that brings up 2 points. One, with your physician leadership group, define the very things that are on the slide. How did our structure work? How does it need to evolve? How did our organizational structure function? And how does that need to evolve? And all of those things need to be brought back to the shared vision. So we emphasized the importance of that earlier. This is a great time to either build or reevaluate shared vision and define what are our expectations of each other from an administrative and provider perspective. What are our expectations on the core qualities, the core makeup of a provider that's in this network, and why is that provider going to enjoy being a part of this network? And how do we create something that we want to build on, and that everybody's excited to be a part of? And this environment creates a great time to do that. So from our perspective, it's one, get physician leaders on board that we need a new normal going forward, and two, build the vision that incorporates everything that we've kind of talked about in today's presentation, because that's the way that you're going to have a path to not only creating the change that you need, but having your providers brought in, which is always the biggest challenge to any sort of change, especially the disruptive change that's happened over the past couple months. So with that, a couple of closing items. Again, reminder, we have additional webinars every Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern. Any of the information that we presented today or other thoughts on employed physician networks can be found under the Thought Leadership tab on our website, hsgadvisors.com. Again, there's a summary article from today's presentation on ache.com. And with that, Terry, I know we're already over time. Any priority questions that would be good for everybody here?
I'm looking, and Travis, it seems that we don't have any submitted from our attendees, so it looks like we're at the end.
Easy enough. Okay, well, we appreciate everybody's time. Again, apologize for stealing 5 minutes of your 3 o'clock hour. We hope today's content was useful. Again, as a reminder, this presentation will be up on our website by this time tomorrow. You will receive an email with the slides and a link to the on-demand version of the webinar for your distribution. We thank you again. Have a great day.